Before the railroad came in 1881, the food had to be transported via wagon loads over the toll road to Silverton. It took 3 days, and there was no refrigeration to get fresh food up to the miners in Silverton. Now, when the railroad opened in 1882, that 3-day trip went to 3.5 hours, and the railroad had refrigeration. They had boxcars that they could put 500-pound blocks of ice in and get fresh food to Silverton.
On October 27, 1870, William Jackson Palmer, a former Civil War general, founded the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. The Denver and Rio Grande competed to have the best route to connect to the mineral-rich San Juans. By 1881, the railroad had extended southwest from Alamosa to Durango and was starting construction to Silverton. When they arrived in the Animas Valley in 1881, the railroad brought commerce and infrastructure to southwest Colorado. After the removal of Ute Indians to reservations in 1881, the San Juan Mountains became an important location for mining, smelting, lodging, commerce, and other urban services, but the economic development was dependent on the development of rail transportation. There is a difference between most railroads you see in big cities and the railroads that once traveled over southwest Colorado. The primary difference between the two is the different sizes of track used. When General Palmer was planning the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, he decided to build it with narrow gauge track. The standard gauge track size is 4 feet and 8.5 inches. Narrow gauge track size is 3 feet and 6 inches. Palmer liked narrow gauge because you can lay track up steep gradients and have sharper curves, which worked better through the mountainous terrain. Later on, as technology improved, about 60% of the railroad had been converted to standard gauge.
Before the railroads, a human being could go about 20 miles a day. And when the railroad came, you could go 200 miles a day. And that sums it up. I mean, right there, the loads that you could carry, groceries, getting food to Silverton over the toll road that took 3 days, and that 3-day trip went to 3.5 hours. And the amount of coal you could haul on the backs of animals was very minimal. And now you could load gondolas that carried 20 tons each, and you could put 10 of them together and take 200 tons of coal to Silverton in one trip. And instead of it taking 7 days to get that coal up there, it would only be 3.5 hours. Yeah, if the railroad hadn't arrived, Durango wouldn't even exist. There would be a little town called Animas City, and it consisted of a farming and ranching community. That was what was here before the Rio Grande arrived in 1880.
After the failure of the Silverton Railroad, Otto Mears and investors founded the Rio Grande Southern Railroad. The railroad was dependent on its connections with the Denver and Rio Grande, where they met at Ridgeway and Durango. At Durango and Ridgeway, they shared rail yards and depot buildings.
The Rio Grande Southern was the other railroad, and it connected Durango with Ridgeway. And so the Rio Grande Southern became operational in 1893. It was built by a Russian immigrant named Otto Mears. The Rio Grande Southern went west out of Durango, up Wildcat Canyon, and through Hesperus. And from Hesperus it went over to Mancos, and from Mancos through Lost Canyon to Dolores, and then up the Dolores River to Rico, and over Lizard Head Pass, through Ophir, then followed itself down the San Miguel River, through Saw Pit, going over Dallas Divide and ending up over in Ridgeway. And Rio Grande Southern went bankrupt in 1953, and it closed for good in 1953. So the railroad operated for 60 years. Otto Mears was an amazing man. Now he operated 3 smaller narrow gauge lines that serviced the mines around Silverton. The Silverton Railroad, the Silverton Northern, and the Gladstone and Northerly Railroad were also Otto Mears railroads. Now the Silverton Railroad operated over Red Mountain Pass, and it was Otto Mears that was going to build that line all the way down to Ouray, and part of that never happened. The plans were laid for the Silverton Railroad to operate from Ironton down to Ouray, and it even involved, it was a cog railroad, and it involved a spiral tunnel that if it had been built, there would have been a spiral tunnel that went down into Ouray, and what an engineering feat that would have been if that had been completed. But Otto Mears was an amazing man, what he was able to accomplish in his lifetime. The Rio Grande Southern hauled all of the ore from Rico and Telluride to Durango to the smelter, where that ore was processed. The Rio Grande Southern, just like the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad, made it all possible to haul, livestock. They hauled a lot of cattle, a lot of sheep. There were a lot of crops that were hauled on the RGS. There was a lot of lumber that was hauled by the Rio Grande Southern. And probably the most famous was as that railroad struggled, and it did struggle because of the terrain that it traversed. Mother Nature was always dealing blow after blow to the Rio Grande Southern, and snowstorms and avalanches and washouts that would take away huge bridges. It would be months before they could get the track put back in. And that was partially what caused the RGS to finally collapse.
The Rio Grande Southern is famously known for rail buses known as the Galloping Geese. These rail buses were built in the 1930s when the RGS was facing more financial problems. The Geese were built out of automobiles like Buicks and Pierce Arrows, and they were cheaper to operate because they only required an operator rather than an engineer and a fireman, and only needed gasoline to run on. These Geese were the only rail cars to operate on a daily basis from the year 1931 through 1949. In June 1931, the first motor was built by master mechanic Jack Odenberg and his crew at Southern Ridgeway shops, and eventually there was a fleet of 7 in operation on the RGS. Even though originally built from Buicks and Pierce Arrows, they were serviceable and definitely fit their purpose to travel through the mountainous terrain. Originally called motors, they got their nickname, the Galloping Goose, from the horns, which could easily be mistaken for the call of a real goose, and they would waddle down the tracks that were uneven and poorly maintained.
But what kept the railroad going for 20 years was the operation of the Galloping Goose. Galloping Goose kept the mail contracts going, and so therefore the railroad got federal money to keep those geese operating, and they hauled passengers, they hauled groceries, they hauled the mail. And they kept the railroad going for another 20 years before it finally collapsed in 1953.
When World War II started, various railroads around the country helped out by donating rail equipment to help transport Army supplies. The Denver and Rio Grande Western and the RGS and various other railroads in Colorado donated rail equipment for a rail line in Alaska taken over by the U.S. Army, known as the White Pass and Yukon Railway. During the war, and when the war ended, some of the railroads who had donated equipment to the Army had filed for bankruptcy and were abandoned due to the automobiles gaining popularity and efficiency. Most all railroads in the U.S. struggled to compete with automobiles and eventually closed down or resorted to something more profitable. After World War II, the RGS was struggling to remain profitable and only had a contract with the U.S. Postal Service and small amounts of tourism to cling onto during its final years. In 1952, the RGS lost the mail contract due to heavy snowfall that winter and filed for abandonment. In 1953, the agreement for assumption of operations was signed by the Director General of Railroads of the United States, and its locomotives and cars were sold to other railroads. Meanwhile, a huge oil and gas boom started in Farmington, New Mexico, and a pipeline needed to be installed. The pipeline would have been shipped out on trucks, but the roads in the area were not in the condition to service thousands of trucks. The pipeline contractors approached the Denver and Rio Grande and made a deal. The Denver and Rio Grande Western at the time was considering abandoning its narrow gauge lines, but thanks to the pipeline shipment, the Denver and Rio Grande Western's life was extended for yet another decade. After the shipment, the Silverton branch started attracting tourism and once again extended the life of the railroad one more decade. In 1968, the route from Durango to Alamosa became no longer profitable and was removed in 1971. The Silverton branch continued to operate, serving the tourism industry of Durango for another 20 years until Charles Bradshaw Jr. bought the railroad in 1981, and it has ran continuously ever since. Ever since these railroads have closed, they have left various remains along their routes. On the Denver and Rio Grande Western, various depots, water tanks, bridges, most of the right-of-way, tons of rolling stock, and two successor railroads still remain to carry on the Denver and Rio Grande's glory. On the RGS, there are still some surviving rolling stock and equipment like the Galloping Geese, but there aren't as many remains on the right-of-way on the RGS compared to the Denver and Rio Grande Western, as the RGS closed 20 years earlier. But we went to explore these remains of the right-of-way. We went from Dolores to Rico to document bridges, water tanks, and other remains of the Rio Grande Southern.
Behind me is the remnants of Bridge 103A. This bridge was where the grade came out of Lost Canyon and headed into central Dolores. The river it crossed was the Dolores River. We are currently at the Dolores Depot, which is a rebuild of the original depot that once stood here today. This is the home of Galloping Goose number 5. Behind me here is the original Rico water tank. A standard water tank like this could hold 50,000 gallons of water. Behind me here is where the remains of the Gallagher trestle would used to be. Where I'm standing would be the abutment on this side, and all the way over there is where the ending abutment would be. We are currently at the Gallagher siding. It is located just a few miles away from the Gallagher trestle. On either side of me is the remainder of the ties from this siding. It was probably used to store extra freight cars or to let trains pass one another. We are currently at the Lizard Head Y. There's currently no remains of this Y, and it is located on top of Lizard Head Pass. One end of the Y used to head towards a stock pen which used to be in this general area. Behind me here is the Trout Lake Trestle. It is one of the only trestles preserved on the RGS route. This trestle is remained almost fully intact, and if these barriers weren't here, you could probably drive across it. Behind me here is the only remaining coal chute along the RGS grade. A coal chute dumps pre-measured amounts of coal into the tenders of the trains down below. Behind the coal chute, you can faintly see part of an old grade that went behind the coal chute, where workers would shovel out piles of coal out of the cars into the chutes above. A worker was called a coal heavy and were paid about 15 cents per hour.